So welcome everyone. Welcome to Soil Health and Community Engagements with the Quivira Coalition. Before we begin, I would like to say a big thank you to our IAC conference sponsors. This session is sponsored by our Champions of Native Agriculture sponsors. In addition to that, IAC is also launching a follow-up survey to the COVID-19 surveys from earlier this year. When they're made available, please take the time to fill those out. We would really appreciate it. And yeah, everyone from the Quivira Coalition can go ahead and take this off.
Thank you. So welcome everyone. Guenter se hopa. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Arielle Quintana. I'm a tribal member from Cochiti Pueblo. And today we're going to be talking about how the Quivira Coalition is partnering with different pueblos here in New Mexico to build resilience through tribal stewardship. And so I'm really honored to be able to present this alongside our partners at the Santa Ana Pueblo Department of Natural Resources, with Victoria Tencio and Dan Guenter, and my colleague Eva Stricker, who is the director of our Carbon Ranch Initiative, will also be speaking a little later in this presentation. So thank you all so much for joining us, and we will go ahead and get started. Eva, next slide, please. So I'd first like to start off with a land acknowledgement. And so the Quivira Coalition is a nonprofit that is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the primary state in which we work in is New Mexico. And so earlier at the beginning of this year, we thought it important and necessary to create a land acknowledgement to really give recognition to the lands on which we are practicing stewardship on. And so I'd like to go ahead and get started with that. We acknowledge that the land in what is currently known as New Mexico is the ancestral and present-day home to the Apache, Navajo, and Pueblo tribes and peoples. This land also housed places of trade, gathering, and ceremony for numerous other indigenous tribes, some of which are still used in such ways. We recognize indigenous peoples as the original and long-standing stewards of this land. Their extensive knowledge and practice of agriculture and land management established the foundation of land stewardship in the Southwest. We recognize that the land and this knowledge was forcibly taken and appropriated from indigenous peoples. As fellow stewards, we honor and respect the land and the peoples who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and we commit to continue building partnerships with indigenous peoples. We offer our thoughts, prayers, and actions to support our indigenous communities, who at this time face exacerbated impacts of COVID-19 due to longstanding histories of disparity and injustice. Next slide, please. Oh, interesting. I'm not, oh, perfect. Okay. So when talking about the work that Quivira is doing in partnerships with tribes, I like to really start off with the how of where we got there. And to be completely honest, the how of that was me. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I'm from Cochiti Pueblo, and so this map on the top left is a picture of our ancestral domain. And so you'll see that little Cochiti is right there, that little blue pin. But our ancestral domain stretches all the way into the Jemez Mountains, all the way to Santa Fe National Forest, into Pecos, and down south to our fellow sister tribes, to San Felipe, and up north to our other sister tribe, Tusuti Pueblo. And so every tribe in the United States has ancestral lands that fall outside of reservation lands. And for most tribes, that means that there's really no say in how we can govern and steward those landscapes. There's really no power that indigenous people have to assert over the care of those landscapes and over the management decisions of those landscapes. And that causes real big issues. You know, when people consider tribes, they think pretty black and white what we can do in reservation boundaries, but every tribe is working really hard to steward their ancestral domain because it is so important and imperative that we continue to foster our relationships that we have with the land. We know how important it is to protect and conserve our natural resources, and to be able to have those for our future generations. And so when I look at Cochiti and when I look at this map to the right, other people may see something, some agriculture fields, a lake, but they don't understand the histories of that. They don't understand how the lake was constructed in the 60s and 70s against the wishes of Cochiti Pueblo and other tribes, and how Cochiti was threatened with being unlisted as a federally recognized tribe, and that we had to agree to it to be built. And they don't see the desecration of those landscapes. When they look to the left, you can see some of those berms that were created after the 2011 Las Conchas fire. And people may not necessarily notice these types of things, but there's a lot of work that tribes have to do in order to even just care for their reservation lands. And there's a lot of support that tribes need in order to be able to conduct that type of work. Most tribes, some, especially Cochiti, we have very limited funding. We're primarily supported on grants. And so for us, having partnerships with people like Quivira is super important and really makes a difference because that allows for other nonprofits, other organizations to go out and seek the funding for us. And they in turn return that back to the tribe, and they let us decide what to do with those funds. And they let us implement projects the way we'd like to, with no strings attached. And that's the type of stewardship and that's the type of collaboration that we really strive to have with our tribal partners. It's not about Quivira coming in to make all the decisions, to tell tribes how to do land management or how to do agriculture. It's about us supporting their goals. It's about us enhancing their ability to care and steward the land. It's about taking a step back and allowing tribes to take the lead. And so for me, ever since I was young, I've always identified myself as a steward of the landscape. And so upon graduating high school, decided to attend Colorado State University, get a bachelor's in science in rangeland ecology and restoration ecology, with my long-term goal is to just always seek to support tribes in their management of reservation and ancestral lands for the betterment of tribal sovereignty. And so after graduating from CSU, thankfully stumbled upon Quivira. And at the time, Quivira hadn't been doing any work with tribes, and which felt very strange to me, especially considering that Quivira primarily, our mission is to build resilience on working landscapes. And those landscapes, the original workers of the land, are tribes, they're indigenous peoples. And so why wouldn't we be working with tribes? And so thankfully, Quivira, ever since I began there back in 2018, has been very supportive of that goal of mine. And so here we are today, looking to establish more formal partnerships and collaborations with tribes throughout the state of New Mexico. We've recently expanded into Eastern Arizona, working with Hopi. And so we're really excited to be able to share a little bit more of our very short history of working with tribes, but the really amazing steps that we've taken to get this far. And then just a little note that I'm also currently a master's student in the Human Dimensions and Natural Resources program at CSU, where I am looking into how to support how to actually move into a future of co-management and co-stewardship between tribes and public land agencies in the Southwest. And so we're really expanding the types of work that we're doing here in New Mexico with the Quivira Coalition. Next slide, please, Eva. And so I wanted to mention a couple of our different projects that we've been doing since we started collaborating with tribes, and the different types of ways in which we have been supporting tribes. And so on the top left, that you'll see pictures from our first workshop that we hosted on tribal lands. And so we partnered with the South Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, Pueblo of Jemez, to offer a one-day workshop on soil health. And so we partnered with folks like NRCS. We partnered with some of our consultants here in the region to be able to offer tribal land managers as well as tribal agricultural producers information on what is healthy soil, what does that look like here in New Mexico, what are primary causes of erosion, how do you actually control those? And so all of our workshops at Quivira have this connection to the land. All of our workshops at Quivira have this outdoor component. where we're actually going out and demonstrating how to look and see these processes and how to actually assess them and how to actually conduct projects to address those issues. And so erosion control is one of our more popular workshops, especially here in the Southwest for obvious reasons. And so every time we host one of those workshops, we're actually out in the field showing people, you know, why are we seeing this specific type of erosion here? What are potential ways that we address it? And then we check out a lot of rock, and we build erosion control structures, and we demonstrate how, you know, as you're, whether or not it's just one person or if it's a team of people, how you could actually go out and build those on your own. And so at Quivira, we recognize that, you know, all of our agriculture producers, especially here in the state of New Mexico, have limited income. And most of the time they have to have a regular 9-to-5 job to supplement, that's actually their primary source of income. And agriculture production is usually supplements that. And so all of the techniques and the different approaches that we teach others are low cost to no cost methods. And so really demonstrating, you know, based on what you have here out on the land, how can you use that? How can you identify those resources? So you don't have to pay to have rock shipped, but so that you can use whatever material you have available on site. We also partner with the New Mexico Tribal Resilience Action Network. And so the NMTRAN is working here in New Mexico to really assess, understand, and to address climate change related issues that Pueblos have and that are facing, and looking to a future of how to build more resiliency towards those different impacts. And so this year we're actually, NMTRAN is hosting a series of workshops called Climate Resilience, the Power of Corn. And so looking to, you know, the long-standing history and resilience of corn in the Pueblo communities, and like, taking lessons learned from that and actually expanding into, great, so if a tribe is looking to build a climate resiliency plan, what does that entail? Where do they start? How do they start to understand what those impacts are? How do they understand the language? Because climate change can be a very technical topic, and has a lot of confusing language. And so helping them understand and interpret that information so that once time comes around when they can apply for those funds, they understand what they're doing and they can present something completed. And so we help them get to that stage, and we offer several different workshops and Quivira partners to help fund those actual workshops. And so this year, obviously, we can't meet in person, and so we are offering those in a virtual format. Also always excited to partner with the Santa Ana Department of Natural Resources. And so we started partnering. Eva will talk a little bit more about our work with them in our Soil Health and Carbon Ranch initiative, but on our education and outreach programming, really wanting to highlight the truly amazing work that they're doing out on their reservation lands. And so what we like to do for all of our workshops is we don't want to bring in so-called experts, and we don't want to just bring in people who are going to talk themselves up, essentially. We want people who are actually doing the work. We want people who are actually willing to share that information with others. And we want people who can walk the talk. And Santa Ana Pueblo is a really good example of that. They have a lot of really amazing projects that they're doing that have the potential to be replicated in other Pueblos. And Santa Ana is more than willing to share their success stories, their failures, and how they reached this point. And so we've been working with them this past year to develop a series of workshops. Unfortunately, also those couldn't happen in person, so we had to translate those to online virtual setting. But we are planning to offer a series of workshops when we all can come back together. And as always, Intertribal Agriculture Council, working with them to essentially, we visit each other's conferences. And so we host a couple of their folks at our conference, have them come to exhibit. They support scholarships for Native youth to attend our annual conference called Regenerate. And we also show up for their conference, because that's what it's all about, working with tribes, is showing up and being there and supporting each of our work. Next slide, Eva. And the last project I wanted to speak towards was our work with the Tri Pueblo Coalition and Trees, Water, and People. And so the Tri Pueblo Coalition is Cochiti Pueblo, Jemez Pueblo, and Santo Domingo Pueblo. Essentially, earlier I mentioned the 2011 Las Conchas fire. And so that, at the time, that was the largest forest fire ever recorded in New Mexico's history. Burnt just over 156,000 acres of land, all of which was ancestral domain to these tribes as well as others. And unfortunately, following the fire, we didn't see a lot of restoration activities and projects being conducted on the sides of the mountain where each of these three tribes reside. We were seeing them in other areas. And so for years, those lands essentially were left to fend for themselves. And the extent and severity and intensity at which that forest fire burned meant that there was, little to no possibility for the mountain to heal itself in a way that it needed to be. It wasn't being cared for. And the Tri Pueblo Coalition recently formed, with the help of Trees, Water, and People, a local nonprofit in Fort Collins, Colorado, that's really built on supporting tribal sovereignty. And so that group formed out of inspiration to want to address those impacts together, and recognizing that, as neighboring tribes, why wouldn't we be partnering? And why wouldn't we be collaborating? And so just last year, we've been working to start tree restoration projects. And so Trees, Water, and People helps to secure plant material of native and traditional and cultural relevant plant species. And the tribes go out and have community plants. This year we had to organize individual plantings by families, but we're making really great progress. And so what Quivira is most excited about this for the future, and working with the Tri Pueblo Coalition and Trees, Water, and People, is we were actually awarded a Native American Agriculture Fund grant for the project of rebuilding Pueblo food sovereignty through rangelands. And so all the tribes, there's varying land types within every reservation, and the primary land types within these specific tribes are going to be forests and rangelands. And our Pueblos, we've heard from our Pueblo partners that they're really interested in addressing rangeland impacts. They're interested in feral forest management. They're interested in soil health. They're interested in their agriculture. And so taking what we hear from them, going out, finding the funding, and coming back and returning and letting them take the lead. That's what it's all about. And so into next year, we are going to be working to support that work and really looking more closely into soil health. And so I'll go ahead and pass the presentation over to Eva, who will talk a little bit more about our Carbon Ranch initiative. Thank you.
Oops, great. Thanks so much, Arielle. It's been an absolute privilege to come in and have so much groundwork laid. The Carbon Ranch Initiative is a relatively new program that Quivira is doing, and I'm relatively new to that position as well. I've been there just about a year now. And yeah, so building up and really, we think about a lot of our role as champion, but champion as a verb. So take what people are already doing really well and helping. So like Arielle said, we of course have a mission, which is to increase organic material on working lands. But we're not going to go do that. We're going to help other people do it. That's the intention. We've got some really great partners here, and happy to talk about any and all of them because they've got great things going on. So Arielle brought up resilience, and one small thing. If anyone heard Nicole Masters, and again preaching to the choir there, that lots of people are on board. So again, keep going. That's my main message. If you're interested in soil health, keep going. But just give yourself a little bit of time to reflect. You're probably hearing a lot of other people talk. And we would love for you to share, and unfortunately we can't see them in real time, but we'll look at the end of words that you might share when you think about soil health. And so we often have people think, what does it smell like? What does it look like? You're sitting in a place with healthy soil. What does it sound like? Is there a taste associated with healthy soil? You know, did you eat the beet fresh out of your garden and you could still smell it and taste that? So I invite you to share or just think to yourself a little bit about healthy soil. It's also going to look different. You know, we're remote, so people are going to be tuning in from all over the world and all over, all over the world. So healthy soil is going to look a little bit different depending on where you are. So
Ava,
to reflect on that.
sorry to interrupt you. You're having some connection issues. Do you want to
I'll go off video.
Yeah, and then it'll hopefully improve.
Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Meanwhile, you had lots of time to reflect on soil health. So the next thing, which is a little bit harder and not quite as hopeful, but needs to be addressed, is what are barriers to improving soil health? So Arielle, of course, identified one, which is that funding is almost always going to be a barrier, and time and money are going to be barriers, but there may be specific things. And sort of one thing that we're trying to invite people to do when thinking about soil health is just get them out, put them on paper. If you've been fretting about things, just having it on paper and having it as a place that you can start is one thing you can do. So we invite you to share if you would like to. And part of that is to just normalize that we're all in this together, and it is really hard. We have these great visions, and then there are also constraints, and that is normal in our experience. And we can have listening sessions. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. We asked people what obstacles stand in the way of practicing and prioritizing soil health. I mentioned a couple of them: the logistics. You don't have time, you don't have financial resources. There's social ones. Well, my family has always done it this way. I don't want to change that. That's really important, both for yourself and whoever you're working with to know, right? And really paying attention to that. Here's one that I thought was really interesting. Up here at information, we've had people provide answers that completely contradict each other, and yet it totally makes sense to me. Both that there's lack of knowledge of techniques and concepts, and that there's too much. So you're overwhelmed, and then you also don't feel like you know what's important. And so this information piece, we think is really important for moving forward. One thing we're trying to do is work really hard with our partnering agencies, with NRCS, with the State Land Office, with trying to get in touch with BLM, and make sure we're just using the same words for things and teaching things in the same way, so that there's some consistent messaging. And that's much slower than each organization doing it. It requires lots of we want to take that time to be in service of the producers that we're working with. So I thought this was interesting. So if you yourself feel that sometimes there's a fire hose of information and yet somehow you don't have the information you need, you're also not alone. Again, that's something we've heard quite a bit. And then here, this was a survey to soil water conservation districts in New Mexico. And this was broadening out to agricultural challenges. And so again, normalizing that there's a lot of things that happen in common. Invasive species, noxious weeds, the changing climate, of course, is, almost half of the people talked about that. Water, of course, being really key in the West. So again, it's really just to say that we're all in this together, which we ideally already know, but if you don't talk to people, it's hard to feel connected, and so this is happening broadly. So our framing of how we want to address this is through the healthy soil principles. There are, depends on who you ask, there's either 4 or 5. Remember, going back to the making sure we have one big disconnect where some people say there's 5, other people say there's 4. And the maximizing biodiversity and integrate animals into land management get combined when you only have 4 principles, and they stand alone when you focus on all 5. But these principles are ways to decision-making framework so that it's not as prescriptive. People don't, you're not told you have to use this kind of cover crop for this period on this farm. It's guiding principles that can help, steer the course towards healthy soil. So minimize soil disturbance, right? Minimize external inputs. It's not hard and fast. There's still room for the expertise and the knowledge of the people who know the land the best, but it's ways to steer the course. And so these we think are really important and are trying to share widely. And we're building out, I think it's my next slide. Yes. So I was hoping we would now, but hopefully by next week, we will have a workbook that's focusing on New Mexico and Colorado, talking about soil health and what that might look like here in the global audience is going to look different depending on where you are. So we're trying to build some vocabulary and shared knowledge around what might be relevant to us here in New Mexico and Colorado. And so, of course, as I mentioned, the Carbon Ranch Initiative, our goal is to increase soil organic matter in the soil. And really that's because it connects so many things. It connects the living and the decomposing cycles throughout the entire soil food web. And that's also how we can store carbon and begin to combat climate change. The last thing I'll just touch on briefly that we've been working on is how to use waste productively. So compost and now biochar are major avenues that we're investigating and doing research around, with the idea that if we can demonstrate the benefits of using the waste that you already have to deal with to build more productivity or to build healthier soils, then it even more value of your time and money. So one case study we've done is up in Polk's Folly Farm. They receive waste produce. They feed the pigs. So the pigs are stomping and pooping in the cages, which they have to do anyway. They turn that into compost rows and then can use that out on their lands. So things like that. The last piece, broadening back out, I went very into our case study, is we want people broadly to understand the context of their soil. And again, this is not prescriptive. It's just things to guide people's thinking already. So things like climate, soil texture, and soil pH are context. You're probably not going to change those in a meaningful way on a human lifetime scale. And you're going to have to work within that. And so there's some simple-ish tests that you can do in field to get a sense of, do you have a sandy loam or a clay-rich soil? And those are the context for how other things are going to behave in your soil. Likewise, you can do the fizz test, which is little kids especially, because can see if your soil is going to fizz like a volcano when you put vinegar or baking soda on it. The next thing that we're really encouraging people to do is monitor and evaluate. And so having, we talked about that vision of what soil health looks and smells and feels like. Well, let's see, make sure that we're all seeing how we're changing. Are we getting closer to that goal, or are we getting farther away? And so there's lots of ways to do that. One is, repeat photos, seeing how productivity is changing. There are in-field assessments of just measuring how often, how much bare ground there is. There's things like soil stability. All of these can be done without any specialized equipment, and are really, I think, fun and interesting ways to see where you're going. And then, of course, there are the lab tests, which require more money and more intensive thought. But you don't have to only do this. There are so many other things that you can learn. And so we just don't want people to be afraid of writing things down and keeping track. So the transition over to Anna is, from anything of what I've said, to the principles and the management and the context, how do those relate to what you already know and what you already do? As I said, I was assuming that I was sort of talking to an audience that would already be familiar with many of these things. And so I would be very interested if you'd be willing to share, answer in the chat box. Otherwise, I encourage you to bring this up over the dinner table or write it down for yourself. And so with that, I'm going to introduce our collaborators at Santa Ana Pueblo, Dan and Victoria. You'll notice that they're already engaging in many of the things that we mentioned, and that's because we were noticing what they were doing and writing it down rather than the other way around. So they're starting this process, and we're following along, and so we're just so grateful that they came to talk about what they're up to. Thanks. Oh, sorry, I had one more slide. That's compost trail. There we go. Now it's on to you guys.
Thank you so much, Eva. I appreciate it. I want to begin by saying thank you on behalf of the Pueblo Santa Ana's Tribal Council and tribal members. My name is Daniel Guenter. I'm the Range Program Manager for the Department of Natural Resources, and my partner on this is Victoria Atencio. She's the Environmental Education and Community Outreach Program Coordinator. Next slide, please. So I want to give a quick overview of where the Pueblo is in relationship. I know we have a lot of different folks from a lot of different areas in on this call, but Pueblo Santa Ana is located in the northwestern central part of New Mexico. Two different sets of property. The one on the left-hand side and the western side was just recently purchased by the Pueblo, and it ties into what Arielle was saying, where tribes are attempting to expand their reach. And so the tribe purchased that land to restore historic tribal lands that they considered or that were part of their historic range. Next slide, please. But most of our work has been done on the original property that the tribe was, the reservation property the tribe has. And that is composed of juniper woodland, grasslands, shrubland, and the grassland is the lighter brown, and then the darker brown is the shrubland. Mostly juniper woodland, or a higher degree of juniper woodland community. And then that's the Sandia Mountains in the photograph on the left-hand side, looking at the Rio Grande Bosque. And so the tribe's been really fortunate. We have, the tribe has 6 miles of Rio Grande property, or Rio Grande riparian habitat, and 10 to 11 miles of Rio Jemez, which is that Rio Grande, or which is that river area to the western part, sort of central western part that cuts across the bottom half of the Pueblo, and those are really important wildlife corridor areas. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I was trying to use the annotate and that I'm not going to try.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So that the next couple slides are just going to be habitat slides. So the Juniper Woodland. So this is a sort of an open canopy Juniper Woodland with a nice grass understory. Next slide. Typical grassland community, Guyetta grasses with some sand drop seed in there and some cholla. Next slide, please. This next slide is a shrubland community that's going to be a dominant sagebrush community, and not the big sage one, but the sand sage community. And those shrub communities typically occur in these sandier soils. Next slide, please. And so the next slide is a riparian community, and that's the Rio Grande, or the Rio Jemez community, floodplain with a cottonwood gallery forest. Next slide, please. So one of the things that's really important for me as a employee at the Department of Natural Resources to carry out tribal leadership's goals for their land, and their goal, you know, primarily all the stuff that I have written on here is you know, important, but their main underlying goal is to leave the land for the next generations, to leave it better than when they took control of it. And they really are working very hard to promote conservation efforts that are going to produce healthy soils, healthy plant communities, and healthy wildlife populations. And that's everything that they do is driven by future generations and leaving the landscape in a better place than when they received it. So next slide, please. So what are we doing? And, you know, our department's been around for 23, 24 years. And the tribe has done a lot, our department's done a lot under the tribe's leadership. And so I'll just go through a brief look at some things that we've done. Go ahead, next slide. But what drives a lot of what we do is environmental and biological data collection. And the slide on the left-hand side of the map of the Pueblo has 144 permanent long-term ecological monitoring sites. And those were put in starting in 1999 and extending to 2001. So the ones on the bottom in red, those points were put in 1999, then the blue ones in 2000, and then the green ones in 2001, because there's a lot of effort to put these plots in. But we measure everything from forage production to plant community data, photo monitoring, and I think Eva talked about that, and I think photo monitoring is it's a super simple way to document what's going on in your land, and I think people often don't realize it can be as simple as photo points. And then we collect a lot of data on soil health as well. And on each one of those long-term monitoring plots, we've been collecting data on soil erosion and or soil accumulation in some cases using erosion bridges. Next slide, please. And so these are going to be a series, the next 3 slides are going to be a series showing you folks that photo monitoring can really make a big difference. And so this was one of those original sites that was put in 1999. And when I look at this photo, I see a you know, what I see is a lot of annual species, which are short-lived, shallow-rooted species, and they're in, you know, nothing wrong with that part of the ecosystem. There's nothing non-native out there, but what I want to see as a landscape or as a land manager, I want to see perennial species. I want to see deep-rooted species that are going to be able to capture and hold soil moisture when we do get precipitation. So next slide. So this is in 2006. There's a dramatic increase, and this was following a 3-year period of no grazing. And it's one of the cool things that the tribe has done, where they set aside over 65% of their land for wildlife, and the other 45% is cattle grazing, managed cattle grazing. This is a great photo. You know, you're seeing a big increase in vegetation, although there's still a lot of annuals there. What I really want to see, so the next slide, is what you see in this next slide, which is everything I'm seeing there is a perennial and a lot of really good cover for soil health, and soil health just leads to healthy plant communities, which then follows, and then you get healthy wildlife communities. They all three just sort of, you know, work hand in hand. So next slide, please. So another aspect of what we do to manage lands and healthy soils is managed livestock grazing, and that's it's a pretty intensive, and it's been ongoing. And like Eva said and Arielle said, it's like this is ongoing. And it's not me, it's me working with the tribal members and me working with the tribe and, you know, at the direction of the tribe to make this stuff happen. And so, you know, we do everything from prescribed grazing plans, the yearly prescribed grazing plans, which change due to weather conditions. We have a livestock forage model that we use to help with our yearly, with our rotational grazing. We use lab fecal analysis to determine if cows are getting enough protein or whatever it is that they need, or phosphorus or nitrogen. We rotate our supplemental feed. We set aside pastures for fawning for pronghorn, elk, deer. We have a pretty well-written and well-followed livestock ordinance right now. And then we've been really ramping up, and this is where Victoria comes in, really ramping up our workshops and education for cattlemen. Next slide, please. And what do you get when you do that kind of stuff? So the stuff on the left is managed pasture on the Pueblo, and then the fence line on the right is the neighbor's unmanaged pasture, and you can see a pretty big difference there. Next slide. Just another example of the difference between a managed grazing. Next slide, please. That you can see that, oh, sorry, go back, Eva. I was jumping ahead of you there. So you can see it just, you know, another slide showing if you use managed grazing, you can see a big difference in grass cover. And so the stuff on the right, if it rains, you're going to lose a lot of soil. You're not going to retain soil moisture, and stuff on the left-hand side of the slide, you're going to see a big increase in soil moisture retention, which is going to be good for plant communities and wildlife and for cattle. So next slide, please. So this is wildlife corridor set aside area. You can see that they set aside a big chunk of area for wildlife. And we're next slide, please. Another thing I think it's really important that folks can do this, put out rain gauges. Right now we have over 24 rain gauges. Next slide on the Pueblo. I'm rushing because we're getting close to our ending here. So you can see we got 20 years of rain gauge data, and it's been really important for us to help monitor what's going on in the Pueblo. And I can talk about this more with folks later on, but I want to get to this next set of stuff really quickly. So go ahead. So this is the compost application project that Eva was talking about that we put together, or we jumped in on with this, with the National Indian Carbon Coalition. And the main goal of this was to try to sequester carbon in the soils and use that for ranchers to be able to make money in another way other than while you're ranching, you can put some compost on the ground, sequester carbon, and, you know, carbon credits, essentially carbon ranching. Next slide. So the bottom line with this is we purchased compost from the city of Albuquerque, applied it to 3 different plots and 3 different grazed pastures. And each one of those grazed pastures was same grazing group, but it was a rotational grazing model. So those pastures were grazed in a different way. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And then it's a typical Gaeta sand dropsy plant community with sandy loam soils. Average rainfall in the Pueblo is 8.68. In the next season, next slide. Okay, so then these are the 3 pastures. You know, what's important, what I want you guys to really focus on is the number of months that the cattle grazed in each one of these pastures. So plot 1, they were in there for 8 months. It's a big pasture. It's got 7,000 acres. And in the Snakehead well, which is plot 2, they were in there for 1 month. And then in plot 3, they were in there for 5 months. And that's 1,000-acre plot, or 1,000 acres. And then look at the distance to water. So distance to water, 4,460 acres works out to a couple miles. So those cattle, to get to plot 1, to graze on that, or to even do anything, we're going to travel 2 miles, and cows are not excited about traveling 2 miles to graze. So just keep that in mind for the next set of photos, or next set of slides. So this is the soil samples and the carbon sequestration, or the carbon percentage. And this was the original, you know, one of the original ideas behind this plot was, you know, are we going to be able to sequester carbon in the soil? So the stuff in 2016 was before the compost was put on the ground. 2018 was a year after it was put on the ground. And if you go all the way to the bottom, that graph on the right-hand side, you can see that there was, you know, it was actually a decrease in carbon percentage in the soil. So at this point, no carbon sequestration. So next slide. But what we did see was this. So this is post or pre-application. So next slide. And this is post-application. This is a year after it was in the ground. And like I pointed out earlier, it was like it was a 10-inch year for us. It was a lot of rain, but you can see that the soils that were outside of that compost plot didn't respond to that 10 inches of rain the way that that compost plot did, which is right in front of you, which is that really lush green looking stuff. So then the next slide. So then the data that we collected on that was, we were trying to quantify what was occurring on those with vegetation. So this is the plot 1 where the cows had to travel 2 miles. It's kind of counterintuitive. On the compost plot, there was less forage available, or there was less forage when we measured it. So we'd go out, clip palatable vegetation on 20 different plots on that compost plot, 20 different sample points. We did the same thing on a control area outside. And lo and behold, there was less forage on the compost plot, but the next slide will show you why. The cows selectively, they went 2 miles from their water source and grazed that 3/4 of an acre plot down. So they were clearly, the cows were clearly recognizing that there was something interesting about that, or something nutritionally valuable about that particular, those plots where that compost was. So that was encouraging to me. Next slide. So this is number 2, and this is the one that was it's more of a control plot because the cows were on there for 1 month and they were on there for the month of November of the year before. So that had an entire growing season. And there was over 100 pounds of forage, more forage on the compost plot than off of the compost plot on the average. So the next one, thank you. So this one's a little trickier. Cows were on there for a longer period of time. It was closer to the water. It was only 110 yards away from water. And so although there is more forage on that one, I think it got hit harder in the summer before. And so I think it took a little while for it to bounce back. So then the next slide. We're also interested in, do we see an increase in cover, veg cover, which you do if you look at this is just plot 2. If you look at the graph on the bottom, you can see that covers increased in the compost transects, and then as you would expect, bare grounds decreased. And then litter is increased in the compost plots as well. And then the slides on the right-hand side are a little more confusing, but the top graph shows grass height at a number of points that we collected on those compost plots. And you can see that overall the grasses were taller in the compost plot than they were off the compost plot, which you could see in that photograph of those of the compost plot next to the native soils. So next slide. So all of this sort of led us to work with the Quivira Coalition, and we've started, I think we're going to be working on 3 different grants, and this is one of the first ones that we started was where we this summer put out 3 1/3 of an acre plots. And then on each one of those, we put those exclosure plots that are in that photograph on the corner to try to, measure what's occurring and keep cattle from just mowing everything down. And then collected data on soils, and we're going to collect data on veg next year. But this year we collected some data on CO2, soil microbial data. So next slide, please. So this is, I'll just very briefly, so this test measures the CO2 output of soils, field soils. So you go out, collect soils. I went out and collected soil from all 3 of the plots that were put in 2017, the compost plots, the ones that we put in 2020, and then just from native soil. Mixed those all together, pulled out my sample, put in the Solvita CO2 level measurements or probes. And the CO2 measurement is a surrogate for soil microbial activity in the soils. And clearly, so the 2017 compost plots clearly had more CO2 output. And then the second one, the ones that were put in 2020, also had more CO2 output. And then the control plots, which is just native soil, no compost added, those had some CO2 output, but nowhere near the other ones. So clearly putting compost on the ground either increased the soil microbial communities or boosted them, increased them. I don't really know what's going on there yet. We need to do more research, but it was pretty exciting to me to see that. So I think we have one more slide and that's it. All right, thank you. Sorry I went over. I apologize.
That was great. Thanks.
All right, thank you. We ended up having just one question, and it's, are you doing any juniper control? And I think that was for you, Daniel.
Yes, we are. We are we used 1933 aerial photography, and we matched that with photography or with satellite imagery. We go in areas where we've seen an increase in juniper trees, one seed juniper, and then we go in and we hand thin those. And then, so we just have a crew that goes out every day and they cut juniper by hand. So we're not having a lot of disturbance to soil. And then they take all of the slash, like all of the branches and cover of that tree, and they just throw it on the ground as cover for ground cover. And then we extract the larger pieces of wood, like the big logs, and then we distribute that to community members twice a year. And that program has been highly successful, and it's been going on since the early 2000s, and we have plenty more to cut. So,
All right, and another question: best suggestions for other tribal land stewards, or best suggestions for other land steward nonprofits trying to build partnerships with tribes, especially in the time of COVID.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The most easiest suggestion that I can offer is to hire Native people in your staff. That's going to be the best way to establish relationships with tribes. There are a lot of really great folks from tribes who have a lot of really valuable experience in land stewardship. They're going to have the connections to the communities. They're going to understand the traditions, the culture, the customs. They're going to have this insight that you can learn on your own if you put the time and effort into it. That's, it's not to say that that can't happen, but it is to say that it's, for me, working with Quivira as a tribal person myself, there is this insider coming in into those, and I have these relationships with these tribes already. And so make it easier on yourself. And we should have more people of color, BIPOC folks in leadership positions within nonprofits. And so that's what I'd really like to strongly suggest. And when you finally get to building those relationships, be willing to explore other areas that maybe you aren't currently working in, especially in times of COVID. A lot of our tribes right now are working to secure different donations for their tribal community members. And even if you're in land and you're doing something that's not necessarily related to that, be willing to put in that effort and to put in that support to helping them with what their current needs are.
All right, awesome. And that kind of sums up the questions we got so far. We're about to wrap it up, but I would just like to say thank you for coming here and speaking and offering your insight. We really appreciate it. And yeah, did you have anything else to offer or say? Otherwise, we can go ahead and end the live stream.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I just
Thank
want
you
to say,
so much.
Neja, to everyone. Yeah, thank you. Wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining and participating today. Eva, go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing. Thanks for having us.
All right, well, have a nice day, everyone.
all right, thank you.
Bye.